I'm Lara Land, somatic coach and yoga teacher trainer, and this is the Beyond Trauma podcast. What a couple of years we have had. The challenges continue to grow, and more of us are experiencing some level of traumatic stress. My commitment here is to bring you the most up-to-date insights on exactly how trauma affects our mind, body, spirit system, and how we can work with our bodies to soften its impacts. You will be hearing from trauma survivors and researchers, and together, we are going to incorporate what they have to teach us to heal ourselves and promote the well-being of all those around us. Here we go. It's out! The Essential Guide to Trauma-Sensitive Yoga is now available everywhere books are sold. This is the book for every yoga teacher, studio, and practitioner who wants to incorporate an inclusive practice to yoga. It's available on my website, laraland.us, and everywhere books are sold. If you're loving this podcast, you are going to love this book. Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of the Beyond Trauma podcast. This came together in one of those truly organic and somewhat magical ways when I was doing one of my book parties for the launch of my book. I was very lucky and blessed to have Linda Sparrowe there. Some of you might recognize that name. She's an author and a mentor and a writing teacher and a yoga teacher, and she's behind many of the yoga books out there. And her child is a grown child, has actually did the photography for my book. And anyway, Linda and Simon were there to support, and we started talking about post-traumatic growth. Now, this is a topic that I have been very interested in and trying to find the right person to get on the podcast to talk to you all about. And it's a delicate topic. So we never want to say, oh, it's great, you had this trauma, now you can grow. I mean, it's a important topic, and there's some research behind it, but we want to have the right voice sharing that. And of course, Linda knew just who that was. She worked on this very special book with Dr. Edith Shiro, The Unexpected Gift of Trauma, The Path to Post-Traumatic Growth. And she said, oh, you have to have her on. And then Edith said, well, you have to have Linda on with me. And, honestly, I thought, how will this go? It's very hard to have two guests. And they both, in their own right, could fill multiple episodes. Well, it turned into magic, real synergy. We were actually on video, which I don't do that often. And it did allow something really special to happen in the conversation. When you listen, look out for the nuance of trauma healing, how it shows up in the body, in our patterns, and collectively. Actually, Edith shares a story. She's down in Miami, and she shares a story from being in Miami. And she also poses a very special question at the end of the episode, which we want you listeners to send your thoughts in. So let me know what you think about this, the answer to this question, and we may have another episode just on it. So a little teaser there. But yeah, Edith's story speaks to collective trauma. And, in fact, she says trauma is never an individual thing. And then we get into a lot. And one of the things that Linda and I get into is about end of life, which some of you have been following, has been a deep interest to me lately. I now working as an end-of-life doula, in addition to my other work in trauma sensitivity and forest therapy. And this is just another avenue of coaching and support that I've brought into my circle of offerings. So there is some profound stuff that we can get to from realizing that life is short. Sometimes it takes a diagnosis to get to that realization. And sometimes through the work I did for the training, we can really visualize that life is short and maybe start living now as if time is short. And how would we want to live and be, and what kind of legacy do we want to leave to others. So this is part of my work as an end-of-life doula, helping people to make meaning and make the most out of that end of time, make choices, difficult choices, have difficult conversations, maybe heal some wounds and have some closure in different areas of life, and also creating some ritual and having some say in how it all unfolds. So if you'd like to hear more about that, it's on my site. I also have some workshops coming up. Still time to catch me in Miami. So take a look at my site and all that jazz. So to introduce my guests today, really, really, again, so blessed to have them. Dr. Edith Shiro is a clinical psychologist in private practice in Miami, Florida, and she specializes in trauma and post-traumatic growth, holding space and guiding her patients to achieve greater potential and higher consciousness. She's the founder of Trauma and Resilience Center, a board member of the World Happiness Foundation, and an active member of Cadena International, providing humanitarian aid and disaster prevention worldwide, and is on the advisory board of International Humanitarian Organization, HIAS. She's worked at Bellevue NYU program for survivors of torture, of the Cambodian Refugee Clinic at Montefiore Medical Center, and the Human Rights Clinical Support Network Refuge, among others. Dr. Shiro offers workshops on trauma-based therapy for mental health professionals and is a frequent guest on various TV shows, podcasts, and radio programs. And of course, we refer quite frequently to her book, which I mentioned, I'll say it again, The Unexpected Gift of Trauma, The Path to Post-Traumatic Growth. Both of these guests said, don't read my whole bio, just, tell them the kind of the highlight points. But I think it's really good to hear all they're doing. They are, like I said, each in their own right, could fill multiple episodes. So our other guest today, Linda Sparrowe, author, mentor, and teacher with deep roots in both ancient and contemporary yoga and meditation, specializes in practices for physical, emotional, and spiritual health. She has served as editor-in-chief of Yoga International and Natural Solutions magazines, and managing editor, acting editor, and contributing editor of Yoga Journal. She has lent her writing and editing skills to a variety of book projects, from celebrity memoirs to spiritual self-help books, from The Psychology of Pleasure to Post-Traumatic Growth. And you'll see how she worked with Edith. You'll see how she's a writing coach and how she helps formulate these ideas. And she really becomes a student of the practice of the writer and helps them to actually clarify their ideas. You're going to actually witness that in this episode. Linda she's authored 6 books of her own, including the award-winning Yoga at Home, Inspiration for Creating Your Own Personal Practice, A Woman's Book of Yoga and Health, A Lifelong Guide to Wellness, and Yoga for Healthy Bones. She's on the advisory board of Yoga and Body Image Coalition and has contributed the leading chapter to Yoga and Body Image and the foreword to Yoga and Eating Disorders. Her talks and practices on body image and anxiety and depression appear on yogaanytime.com, yogauonline.com, as well as audio and video interviews. Outside the office, Linda's continued her commitment to holistic health. She was instrumental in launching the Courageous Women Fearless Living Retreats for women with breast and reproductive cancers. This is her heart's work. She talks about it a lot in the episode. And she also speaks about and leads workshops on grief and loss, moving through the stages of our lives, and how yoga helps us to learn to love ourselves. We will all be touched by cancer, by loss, by grief at some point in our lives, and having some different frameworks for looking at it, for grieving, and for the stages, which we're going to learn a lot about today, the stages that can lead us to post-traumatic growth, and why we should all be thinking about this, even if we don't consider ourselves a trauma survivor. There's a really good point on this, again, towards the end of the episode. So make sure you listen all the way. Awesome. Again, a really deep-hearted welcome and gratitude to the both of you, Edith and Linda. Wonderful to be connected to you both and excited about just all the directions this conversation could go. It's always interesting, especially when we have more than one. This is my second time with more than one guest. So I'll let a lot of, what's interesting us and the two of you lead us in various directions. But to start us off, I really want to talk about this idea of post-traumatic growth. That's at the heart of why we're here, because I think this is very, very important and an area that people don't necessarily know about. So, can you tell us what is post-traumatic growth?
So, Lara, thank you so much for the invitation. And I always happy and ready to talk about post-traumatic growth, which is the title of part of the title of my book, The Unexpected Gift of Trauma. And it's been the focus on my research and my clinical work for the last 20 years. And not many people know about post-traumatic growth. People know about post-traumatic stress and they know about PTSD, which, by the way, yesterday was the National Day of PTSD or something like that. Yeah, there's even like a national day for that. So that's how recognized PTSD, which is the very negative and difficult symptoms that people go through when they're traumatized. But what people don't know is that, or they're less informed, is that sometimes even when you go through trauma or you go through very challenging, difficult situations in life and experiences, you can also gain so much and you can evolve, develop, transform in ways that you can't even imagine. And the result of that is called post-traumatic growth. So it's the positive changes, the positive outcomes that can come from facing and dealing and processing challenging experiences. So, we call that post-traumatic growth because it's a series of criteria and characteristics that people with post-traumatic growth show.
I'm sure people want to know, how can they be in that category? So some people go through traumatic experience and then they are in a trauma response for a very long time, maybe ongoing. Some people get through it and they're able to function. And then there's this other category that's able to thrive and have this growth. So what makes them special? How can we get there? What do we need to know? What do we need to do so that we end up in that space?
Yeah, sounds like you read the first chapter of my book because
I read the whole book.
because that's exactly, the three groups that I've seen, in observing post-traumatic growth and learning about it and studying it and promoting it in my practice as well, which is like, and the question, like, what makes a difference really between people that stay stuck in repetitive behavior, in traumatic symptoms, in trauma response, and what is it that makes a difference for people to thrive, to do a leap forward, to do a quantum leap into something else, and to become the people that they want to become without even knowing that they can't sometimes. And I think there's a key element here that I see is that first is that people are aware that this is a possibility, and that's why writing a book about it and talking about it, which I've been doing for all these years, and promoting it and bringing consciousness to it is so important, because most people think that once you have a trauma, especially if you have a big trauma, big huge event, people feel that might be like a life sentence. And the good news, and Linda and I talk about this all the time, is that the hope that this brings of knowing that there's a possibility, an option, an opportunity for growth after trauma is huge, because it gives the people a chance to say, oh, well, I didn't know there's something else. There's like a light at the end of the tunnel. There's something else that I can do with this. But the other thing about it is that, yes, you're aware of it, but the next thing is that you want to have the willingness to do it, or have the courage. I say it takes courage to go through this process, and we'll tell you more about the process, but it does require you to want to go through this, because this is not like a button that you press, or this is not like a switch, like from one day to the next you're done, it's a quick pill. No, it takes time, it takes dedication, it takes persistence, it takes processing it. So yes.
Yeah, you really have to go into it in order to grow from it.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think when you heard about this, Linda? I mean, you've been working in yoga, and yoga really as a healing modality, and for so long. Had you thought about post-traumatic growth before, and what's been some of the, surprising things that you've learned from working with Edith?
Well, first of all, I feel like I am a graduate student in trauma working with Edith because we worked, oh my gosh, like a year and a half at least together. And I had the honor of helping her translate this vast amount of knowledge and wisdom into this book where people could say yes, right? Could really see this. And I never thought about, there are a number of things in the book that Edith will talk about that were so beautiful to me because I could put them in context also with the work that I do. Like it wasn't a vocabulary that I had, right? And yet working with people who are dying, particularly women who are dying or who have split from themselves in multiple ways, to know that there is actually a path, a really specific path has been really beautiful. And to know that when we heal. Growth means in Edith's heart and in her experience in the world is that we grow not in spite of what we've been through, which is really more about resilience, which I know that Edith will talk about. We really grow because of it. And we see examples of that all the time. But I never had the vocabulary and the path to understand how to walk that path. It was pretty exciting. It really has been one of the most enjoyable collaborations I've done in a long time. I know.
You're getting lots of love there. Is there a certain time in the process that a person should be introduced to this concept? I mean, I can imagine if I've just been through something, I don't want to hear that it's going to be good for my growth.
Yeah, Linda and I talk about that too, right, Linda? We always laugh about this because when you're in the middle of that traumatic experience and you're suffering and you are really going through those trauma responses that you were mentioning, the last thing you want to hear is that you're going to get a gift out of this. And people might even be offended, to tell you the truth. It's like, be careful to say something like that to somebody that is in the middle of experiencing the trauma, because it's like, how can you even come to me and tell me that I'm going to get a gift out of this? And some people have told me, it's like, wow, the title of your book it has trauma and gift in the same sentence. How is that possible? That's a contradiction. That's like, doesn't make sense. And it's only when the person is ready to almost like radically accept what they've been going through. It's when the person is going through so much suffering, when they've hit rock bottom, when there's nothing else, when they've already explored all their survival responses or their fight, flight, freeze on every response that they've had, and they're still in the same place, that they really are open and willing to maybe say, I have to surrender to this. And that's where the process begins. But Linda, what do you think? I'm curious also to see what you think about when is the right time to, have you seen?
Right. I mean, one of the things that you talk about in the book that I think is really important for me and for the work that I've gotten to do is that we talk about the idea that, first of all, I have no idea as a facilitator, as a friend, as anything, to know exactly what you're going through. So for me to come and say, oh, you know what, it's going to be fine. I have to, as someone with trauma, I have to feel it. I have to really understand what is, I have to live this and fall apart and right. And so to have someone come too soon, it's not going to work. I don't even know it's trauma. I don't even know anything. I just know that I've had this horrible experience, right? And it is when, like, even with work that I do with women with cancer who are stage 4, who really feel like this is it, right? Who am I to come to them and go, oh, it's going to be fine, right? But when they are ready, when they say, you know what, I don't want to be this. I don't want to live like this. And they find a sense of community and they can say, all right, I'm ready. But it has to come from them. And it has to come at a time when they're not in the experience. Don't you?
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that I do Yeah, I totally agree with you. And one of the things that I do with my patients is that I become the holder of their hope in some ways. I say, even though you don't see it yet, and I'm with you 100% in this space of like hopelessness and helplessness and not even seeing everything is dark, I'm going to be holding that hope that there's going to be light later on, or there's something else that is going to evolve from what you're experiencing now. And from I can say to them, I have the experience, and my personal experience and my professional experience allows me to tell you that there's something else. But right now, you are in this place of maybe not seeing it, and that's okay. But that little kernel of like possibility, I think, can get, a seed in there that says, maybe I can open up to something later on.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I love that. Just having someone else believe in you or see a possibility for you that you can't see for yourself is such a beautiful and powerful thing. And it allows them the time to, like, I'm not ready to be there. It's okay. I'll be there. And also with you where you are now. I mean, I think that's beautiful. You say in your book that trauma is part of life and unavoidable. Can you expound on that a little more?
Well, because sometimes the word trauma can, for a lot of people, can be associated with something very drastic and extreme. And I understand that's where the word originally comes from, especially applied to war veterans and really severe, out of, completely outstanding experiences. Nowadays, I think the more we learn about this and the more we deal with emotions and with deeper processes as we are, I like to expand the term of trauma. And I say that, first of all, it's a very subjective concept, meaning like I cannot determine what is traumatic for you and you cannot say what's traumatic for me, right? If I say my divorce was traumatic and you say, but you had such an easy divorce, you love each other, there was no fight, everything is wonderful, you're friends. Yeah, but for me it was traumatic. I mean, even if you see it in another way, right? Like, so that's one thing. So it's subjective. The other thing is that trauma is also relational. So it's not just the trauma of like going to war or the trauma of an earthquake or the trauma of a building collapsing on you. It's also the everyday trauma, the trauma of everyday life, meaning like there are little things that happen chronically. For example, sometimes the relationship that we have with our mother or with our father that keeps happening every day as we grow up in our development is traumatizing, but we don't get to even become conscious of it until we start exploring it. For example, Linda and I talk about this a lot, the microaggressions that can happen in our culture, right? As a racist microaggressions or a cultural, religious, gender-based, that it's not like a huge event that happens, but it's little things that keep happening that are everyday kind of traumas. Bullying that happens with children in school. I can't tell you the amount of adults that I have in life and right now in my practice that tell me, well, I was so bullied or I was really rejected so much in school that even today as a grown-up, as a married person, I'm still dealing with those kind of traumatic experiences. So things that sometimes we can't even become aware of, that then later on we see that we develop trauma responses or survival responses. And those are traumatic experiences too. So expanding that term is very important. And it's not, one other thing that I say is that it's not just the event itself, but it's also what's happening around it and what's inside you that's happened, the amount of support that you had. If you're moving from one country to another, but you have so much support, you have people around you, you have resources, maybe the experience of trauma is different than if you move from one country to another and you are so isolated in your experience that you can't even begin to share it with anybody else. So
absolutely, such a good point, because the same event or events can land completely differently depending on inner and outer resources. So it's a really important thing to remember.
I think a lot of the work also that you do, Edith, is to look at like trauma is something that gets stuck inside of us, right? So it's not something that, like, a lot of people will say to me, I do a lot of grief work, and a lot of people say that grief is really traumatic. And, sometimes I think it really is, particularly when there's stories attached to it. But a lot of times we're just dealing with processing emotions. And so I think that's really different than having trauma stuck inside of you. And then to appear when, like this whole bullying thing, to realize that part of my personality, the way that I deal in the outside world, is partly because of my past. So I'm not fully present. I'm still stuck there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really interesting. That was really interesting to me in working with Edith, was to find like how many things are just stuck in our tissues. We say that in yoga all the time, Laura, right? It gets stuck in the fascia. It gets thick. Whatever that is, right? It's not released. And that's really what Edith's work moves toward in post-traumatic growth, is the acknowledgement, the validation, and then the release of what's stuck.
Yeah, it's almost like not grieving actually is what could potentially be the trauma response. And this kind of leans into the resilience mode, or, where we have all these adaptations, physical, emotional, and they can become so much a part of life that it can take something to see that we're doing them, because they just become how we are. And then we're being ruled by this trauma that we may not even realize we're being ruled by something else.
Totally. No. I love how you make the distinction, and actually totally agree that not grieving is what is traumatic. Grieving is absolutely normal and accepted and wonderful that we go through. Yes, it's painful. Yes, it's hard. Yes, but it's not trauma. That's not trauma. Trauma is the opposite. There's a mystic that talks a lot about trauma called Thomas Hubel. I don't know if you know. And he talks a lot about collective trauma, and he says that we have normalized so much our trauma responses that we're not even aware that we're in trauma, because they're part of our everyday lives. So we can if we were really to deal with our collective trauma, and not just from this generation, but even our ancestral collective trauma, we would be behaving in very different ways, right? Because we wouldn't be, there's so many examples of like trust issues, and how we relate to one another, and how we react to different things that are so trauma-based. Even in our bodies, the way that we handle our body and the way that we position ourselves, right, in space, is so based in trauma that we don't even realize. And that until we work on that, if we become aware of it, not just individually, but as a collective, our response would be very, very different. And our sense of freedom, our sense of creativity, our imagination, our exchange with one another would be very different.
Yeah, because we pass those patterns on to others, and it's cyclical and relational and generational. As you're talking so much about embodiment, I wonder if Linda, if you might want to share some of the ways you've seen this, people process both in the yoga space and maybe writing, telling their stories. Because I'm sure a lot of people are processing with you. Obviously Sean Korn comes to mind, through telling their stories, and the act of writing, which is physical as well as emotional, intellectual, all of it.
That's so interesting that you say that, even looking at Sean Korn's book. One of the things that I often do when people get stuck, because naming our history, naming our trauma, naming our experience brings us right back into it. And that in itself is a trigger for most people. And for a lot of people, just shuts us down. Like, I can't even write about it. I can't express it, because then it's going to become real. Right. And one of the things that Sean talks about in her podcast and stuff, when she talks about our process, is that I had her actually write in present tense. And then in her actual book, what became present tense, and Edith and I did this a little bit too, is that were the places in the story that really brought whatever it was we're talking about, to life, right? But it was really, really hard for Sean to be in that present tense because you're there and you're not a 50-year-old woman then putting this gloss on. Well, I used to think that, but now you are that 21-year-old whose really, really beautiful friend is dying of AIDS. So you are there. You are there when you were 8 years old and were abused. So writing can be incredibly powerful. But when I teach it, same with yoga, like my whole mantra when I teach is, isn't that interesting? I say that all the time because I want people to not judge so much. Like, isn't it interesting that every time this happens, this is my response? Like, where is that? Where does that come from? All right. And where does it land in my body? Like someone said this and I could feel it in my groin or I could feel it in my throat. What is that? Write that, right? What is the felt sense of that? Don't try to go back and write the whole story about why and where and who. It's where is that felt sense? Where do you feel it, right? And how do we soften it? Or do we? Do we need to, right? And then we do prompts like, I remember, ... right? Or one of my favorites is, I don't remember. So that's been super fun. And sometimes when I work with women, just recently, I guess a year or so ago, I had a workshop, and I'm known for working with women, right, in the stages of our lives and all of that. And these women, there were about 30 of us, and they really wanted to talk about like how, the stages of their lives. And so we did some asana for sure to get us in the body. And I don't actually do writing prompts unless I do a really deep visualization first, like be there, be in relationship with that story, and then bring forth what it's asking you to bring forth, right?
Yeah.
So I just said, there's lots of little asanas we can do for this and for that, but what does it feel like to come into relationship with this part of you in this moment that's changing? What is the story? What is the dialogue that we have with that part of us? And yes, it's a little bit like, family systems but it is that welcome to the table kind of thing, right?
Completely.
So I think with Edith's work, I've just grown so as someone who could help women really move from one stage to the next,
Yeah, no, and that's why what Linda is saying is that's why working with trauma cannot put on aside working with the body. It's essential and it's required that we go to the body, and not just because it lives there, not just because the body keeps a score, but because the way that we process trauma from a neurological perspective is that our brain is in such a way that it stores it in a place that it's not readily accessible for a very good reason. And the reason is that our bodies are protecting ourselves from painful, dangerous feelings, experiences. And we on purpose store this in parts of our brains that don't have access for memory or for presence. And, sometimes we even dissociate from these experiences to protect ourselves from living in a constant state of danger and running away or being in attacking mode, or because then we can't function. So it's only through passing the conscious mind and passing the brain and the thinking and the prefrontal cortex that we are able to get into a more subconscious and more unconscious places in our body that then trigger those memories, believe it or not. And well, you know this, I'm sure, that touching parts of our body trigger very specific memories of trauma. It's like little buttons that you press in your body that trigger memories because that's where the memory got stored, right? In like those nervous system connections or neuropathic connections or synapses connections that make all this memory get constructed again in our bodies, and then we relive it as if it's happening in the moment, which is what our bodies are protecting us from in the first place. So when we are doing the work that, let's say, Linda is doing with the yoga, we have to be very mindful that the moment you are touching these places in in the body, you are opening up for processes, right, that have been stored and protected and put away to not have this overwhelming reaction of trauma again. So it's beautiful when you have somebody so conscious and aware to do this kind of work.
Yeah. Well, Laura does this work really beautifully as well. So I just want to acknowledge that, Laura.
Oh, thank you.
And that's why we're talking about it with Laura.
In this context where we're talking about the two of you.
I know,
But thank you. And and obviously we met through that.
Yeah, but that's why it's good to talk about this kind of topics with people like you, Lara and Linda, that are so aware and conscious of this work.
But
Yeah.
what I think is interesting too, Edith, is that when we have these moments and we can actually identify where in the body, like when we're triggered or when something happens, and we can actually feel that shit, my heart is like racing or I'm sweating or what is happening here, right? And so to be able to connect a feeling or a memory with something physical, with something concrete like this, we can say, and we can begin to get that association, right? And like for me, it's like I used to say to my kids, like, if you're really angry, what would happen if you just open your hands? Does that change that feeling? Maybe like a little tiny bit, does it change? So to know that we have agency.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. When you're like crawling up, I'm sure you guys know this, when you're crawling into yourself and you're protecting your chest and your front part of the body, you are in survival danger place. When you open your chest up and your heart is out and you are showing yourself to the world, you're saying, I trust myself and I trust the world and I'm ready to experience it, right? So even just the position of the body is so associated with how we are relating to our own trauma and how ready we are to receive and to trust.
There's so much there from the both of you. I mean, a lot of things are coming to my mind right now. I mean, the first, I just loved that, Linda, about opening the palms when you're angry. And it reminded me of a way that I work with my yoga students. It's like when things get hard, when you go into a difficult position, the inclination is to tense up and fight through it. And actually what makes the posture easier and come alive is relaxing. So it's kind of training the opposite response, which is something really interesting that can be learned through the yoga practice. I think it's one of the wise things that I learned through my own practice is to kind of soften when things are hard, which is, and then as you were talking, Edith, I was thinking, oh my gosh, yeah, to open like that. I mean, that's challenging for those of us who haven't even been through like what we would say is like a big trauma. So I'm really feeling into the vulnerability of that and the letting go. I do want to make sure that we talk about that. Like it feels to me like we kind of are talking about letting go of some of that resilience that we've built in order to dare into something new. And so I wonder if you want to speak to that. Yeah.
But so let's make a distinction between what it's like not to be ready or being resilient. So resilience, it's a wonderful thing for people to have resources and tools to face difficult situations. And I'm all for that. And it's a bouncing back into, being able to deal with things. And actually in the process of getting to post-traumatic growth, you develop resilience. So it's a good thing to have. I support that. The thing is that when you are in situations in which what you're using is repetitive behaviors to protect yourself, it's different than being resilient. Is that you're not even aware of the connection with your emotions and with your body and with yourself and also in your relationship with others. So that kind of disconnect is what keeps you in a traumatic state. So that's why these 5 stages that I talk about and that, that we're writing and we're proposing here about post-traumatic growth requires that if I'm going to open that chest and I'm going to say, here, I trust the world, that you come to the second stage of safety and protection. You don't just do that. You, after the first stage, which is, radical acceptance, because when you are radically accepting, what's happening with you and the symptoms that you have, and realizing, let's say, that you're closing your fist or that you're tight or that you're struggling with something, even in yoga poses, it's like, okay, let me accept that. Because if I'm in denial and saying to the yoga teacher, no, I'm not, I'm doing fine. I'm doing it. What are you talking about? Look at my pose. It's beautiful. It's a metaphor for life also, right? It's like, nothing wrong with me. I'm doing fine. It's only when you get into that radical acceptance and say, oh, yes, I am, clenching my fist, or I am tight, I am resisting, that you can go into the next stage, which is, let me be in a place where I can feel contained and I feel that I trust that it's a safe space. And that maybe the relationship that they create with you, Lara, or with you, Linda, as a yoga instructor, as a yogi, to say, I can trust this space to maybe let go, to do that surrendering and to show up with my feelings, with my vulnerabilities, with my weaknesses, and be willing to put a name to it and be willing to identify it, because part of the trusting is knowing that the other person or the other group or that container is going to validate and acknowledge and recognize what you're going through. And that's really a key part of that trusting process in order to move forward. And that's why there's so many collective traumas out there and individual traumas that have not been able to move forward, because there's not that recognition, not that validation, and not acknowledgement of that. Like I was just honoring the 2nd year anniversary of the building collapse here in Miami, where 100 people died. And here we are sitting in our big ceremony in the city with all the big politicians and the commissioners and the mayors and all the families there 2 years later. And part of that resentment and anger and sadness and mourning has not been able to advance and heal, because there's no recognition, like public recognition of the responsibility and the not just acknowledgement, but the accountability that the community has, or that the people responsible have, in order for them to say, I've been heard, I've been seen, I've been validated, now I can move forward. So they're stuck in that, like, let me show you how I'm suffering. Let me show you that I'm right. Let me show you how much what I'm feeling, how much I'm suffering, how stuck I am. Because there's no one, not entity, collective entities there that is saying, I see you, I validate you, and I take responsibility and for this, and the accountability for what's happening. So
I really appreciate that example, and reminds me of so much of your book, because you really speak to like systemic and the collective, and you say over and over again that trauma is not an individual thing. So thank you for giving us an example like that. I mean, so often people are not going to get that accountability from the one that they want. They're never going to hear that, sorry, I hurt you. So we have to find it some other way, right? Maybe through a support group, through a therapist, through a yoga teacher, a friend, someone that will believe us and hear our pain.
Yeah, exactly. It's interesting that you started to bring up the idea of resilience, because in Edith's book, I think that she makes a really strong sort of commitment or argument even about how resilience can sometimes get in our way of growth, right? And there are some people actually that aren't interested or not ready to move into growth, and I think that the idea, especially in our culture right now, we talk so much about resilience. There's workshops, every time I turn around about being more resilient, and I think that Edith makes a really wonderful sort of way of looking at when resilience is actually really beneficial and when sometimes it could get in the way. And maybe, Edith, you could talk a little bit about that, because I found that immediately fascinating when we first started talking.
Thank you, Linda. You're biased, but no, yes, it's this idea of like keep defending and keep developing and keep saying, okay, I can do this, and even our culture supports that so much and saying, no, don't get into your grieving, don't take so much time into feeling your feelings, don't open the space, take a pill so you don't have to cry every day, right?
I'm fine.
It's
I'm
like,
just fine. Right.
how many times we listen, but move on. Are you ready to move on? And let's move on and moving on, right? And there's that honoring the space to really feel the feelings, to really touch that rock bottom, to sit with your shadows, to really allow for all these fears and doubts and insecurities to come up. Doesn't really happen because we're living so fast, and we have to show our selfies in our social media that we're doing great. So, my thing is that if you want to reach post-traumatic growth, if you really truly want to be connected in a way that is meaningful, that you really are aligned with your life purpose, if you want to have a more spiritual connection with yourself, you have to sit with those feelings, and you have to not be so resilient and show that you can do everything and you're a superwoman or a superman, right? Like you can that you can allow yourself to not look so good and go through so much pain. And it's not, of course, nobody wants to go through pain and nobody goes through suffering. But what I've seen so far is that only when we allow ourselves to go through it, to something that is already there, and we really go all the way, that we can come out transformed, and that it's painful and it's difficult and there's a lot of maybe destruction and reconstruction that happens inside and out, but then we are this beautiful butterfly that that can fly. And Linda and I always use this example that the caterpillar really goes in there into that cocoon and that gets destroyed. I mean, literally all these liquids and everything are not, there's like nothing from what the caterpillar was, and then it becomes this beautiful butterfly. And if you interrupt that process, there's no butterfly to be seen. So it really takes that all those stages to get to the other side, and that's why sometimes resilience doesn't allow for us to that. So it hinders that process of growth.
And I think what really happens is if we can't radically acknowledge not only that this was a traumatic thing that happened, but that we're reaching out. It's time, right? If we're just, no, I'm strong, I got this. What trauma? I don't know what you're talking about. Then we kind of motor on. And sometimes something happens, and as Edith says, it could be something almost seemingly inconsequential, and bam, right? Everything sort of falls.
Right.
But the coolest thing that when we were talking about this whole butterfly thing, the coolest thing that connected it deeply to Edith's work, to growth, is that, first of all, the caterpillar, goes into this thing. And if we anthropomorphize, it's like without a clue of what's going to happen, right? So there you are, and this chrysalis completely dissolves everything. But in the making of the butterfly contains the parts of the caterpillar. And so, right. And so all this goo, part of it becomes on purpose, becomes the, little tentacles or whatever. Part of it becomes the wings. And so in the whole thing about growth is that we are transforming, and we're bringing along what broke us, what our joys, our sufferings, all of it. So we're not saying, wow, I got through that, and thank God I don't have to do that shit again. What we're saying is, wow, because of that is now in my fascia. This is in my fingers. It's in my speech, whatever, right? It's in my determination. And so we become more resilient to the next thing. Is that what I need? So that after growth, we go, hey, I think I can do this. Right?
So are you kind of bringing us into this third stage of becoming?
Right. Yeah. So the third stage.
That did it, not me.
I don't know. It just seemed like we're naturally going through the stages.
Yes, we are. No, I love it like that. But also the third stage, which is new narratives, is really before we even integrate everything that Linda was saying about how it gets all integrated. There's that exploration that what else is out there that is new that I don't know about, because all my belief system, my understanding of the world, of myself has been shattered. So people are really open to exploring new things. This is when you get all these new people that want to do yoga with you and say, I've never tried this. Let me see what it's like to be in touch with my body and to, explore myself from a different place. Or people going to reading different books, or people going to new religions or new spiritual awakenings, or start to dress differently, or have new groups of friends, right? Or they style their hair. It's like changes that are happening it's like you're trying out new things until you find almost like a new set of beliefs or new understanding, a more expanded notion of yourself and the world. That's the new narratives. And then you get into the integration, which Linda explains so beautifully, because it's like you get all these pieces, the new and the old, to really reconstruct yourself. And you get to the fifth stage by the way, and in this fourth stage of integration, you're able to look at the traumatic event without having that reaction, without feeling like you're in the present moment, feeling it and reliving it, which is the beauty.
And I just want to say about the narrative stage as well, because I really like how you describe that, trying on something new. And I mean, I just see that so much in my life, how, exploring different parts of self. And a lot of people, when they hear about like, write a new narrative, write a new story for yourself, it feels very, see, like those of you who can't see, you'd see like Linda's making a face, I'm sorry. I heard that, take the story and write it, make a new ending or whatever. And it falls flat, and that can push people away. But the way you're describing it is much richer.
But because you have to go through the other two stages before that. Because what are you going to write new if you haven't recognized and identified what's happened to you? Mm-hmm. I mean, so it comes from like more of a false place of like keep repeating the same thing. It's like really cracking up for the new things to enter. But how can you write something new if you haven't cracked up?
Right, because then if you really don't dig deep, you end up, no matter how hard you try,
exactly,
you will see that you have somehow just done the same pattern.
The same pattern,
I know, right?
Yes, because there's nothing to draw from. And then you go to the integration stage, and then you go to the fifth stage, which is the stage of wisdom and growth, my favorite stage, in which you really truly are in a place where you see your priorities and different. You understand what your priorities are. You're able to connect with yourself and with others in a more meaningful way. Most people report having a spiritual connection or spiritual understanding, and it's not religious at all. What it means is like it's more like you're connected with the whole, or with the universe, or there's a higher sense of self, or something like we're all interconnected. People usually at that stage have a clearer understanding of their life purpose. They become more like, I know why I'm doing this. This has more meaning, or I have a life mission. And most of the time it's related to their wound. So their wound, their pain becomes their purpose. The wound becomes the medicine. It's like the breakdown becomes the breakthrough. That's where it's like, that's when you see people that are like the mentors of people that are struggling with addiction or alcoholism, have been alcoholics themselves, or people that have gone through sexual abuse are the ones that are opening the centers for sexual abuse women, or the people and so on and so forth. So it's a beautiful thing to see, because it's not just a transformation for yourself, but you're really giving back to the community in a beautiful way.
I love that.
I think that the stages make so much sense, because just in a way, what you were saying, Laura, is that we can't expect to feel that there's wisdom within the wound unless we're able to say, I am a woman who was sexually abused, and I am also a woman who is strong and capable and ahead of, whatever I am, right? And so until this experience, this trauma becomes an experience and part of my past that has made me who I am now, then there's no way we can take it forward into growth and into wisdom, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It has to be with us and a part of us and not shut away.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is. It is a part of us. Even if we try to shut it away.
I know.
Then
It's louder, doesn't it?
yes. This meaning, talking about meaning and finding meaning and making meaning, meaning that arises it almost seems like it sometimes arises just from going through the steps. Like we kind of naturally step into that next phase when we've done that. Linda, I don't think you know this, but I've just completed doing a certification in end of life doula.
You did?
Yes.
Wow.
I did it with Henry, Fink Weiss. Do you know who he is? Finkel Weiss.
And they call it doula? It's actually,
which is a different.
Yeah, Frisco Weiss. Henry Frisco Weiss. Sorry, Henry. Hopefully he will come on.
I know of him.
Yeah, very known and respected in that space. And
good for you.
Yeah, and a lot of your work is right there, and a lot of the stuff we're talking about. I mean, a lot of things that came up in this conversation around, because the doula process, end of life doula process, can range for quite a long time, from getting a diagnosis and after the death, part of the grief process with family. And so there are a couple of things that have come up related to that. And I definitely wanted to touch on that since it's so alive in me right now. The pushing away, telling people to grieve faster and pushing that away. And then also the beautiful thing that came out of this course, which is what I realized about how much meaning a person can get to, after a diagnosis, and knowing that there's a short time.
That's for sure.
You want to speak to some of, what you've seen and been a part of in folks' process of that?
Well, first of all, it's really interesting because, again, it aligns with what Edith's saying a lot, is that I wrote an article about this years ago with this organization I helped found called Courageous Women, Fearless Living. And it is for women, and it's a Buddhist meditation, yoga, art, music, dance, whatever, coming together for a week up at a sacred space in the Rockies. And when people first come there, the women are so frightened. Nobody wants to sit next to each other, because if I'm now in remission and this person has been and suddenly she's in recurrence, I don't want to even be near her, because what if that rubs off on me? My hope is now drained because of her experience, and her experience becomes a trauma marker in some sense to my own experience, right? And so there's a lot of wigs and lots of clothing on and people not speaking or not. And then we do this Tibetan thing where we break up in what we call delics, which are little communities of care. And there's one person who's generally comes from that tradition or mindfulness meditation tradition to not really lead, but to hold space, right? By the end of it, people are like on each other's laps. They're bald. They're like almost naked, and there's so much joy and laughter that comes out of even. And back up. So Judy Leaf, who is a longtime incredible presence in the death and dying, grief and loss space, and she wrote a book, Making Friends with Death. She always did a loss and change workshop that was always, it's just optional. And maybe a few people the first couple of years would come, and it was just, and she's so gentle. And then we've been doing this 15 years. And so then it became the thing that people wanted to talk about. And people in stage 4, people who are actively preparing to die, in some ways were the most joyful, the most loving and connected and funny people that I have ever come across, laughing at themselves, looking at, here, this is me, this is who I am, I'm all love. That is all I got left, right? And that is like really the power and the beauty of community, and in a community where you can really come in to your body and also share your grief, your laughter, and your support and your ideas with other people, right?
Yeah. And like you say, Edith, the gift of trauma, the gift of knowing, none of us knows. And the gift of this course has been my remembering. I've gone through this process a few times in my life. I'm always really grateful for it because, of course, we naturally go back into this kind of regular way of being where we pretend that we're not going to die, and right. So having that very present to be able to live in that way before getting that close,
Right.
yeah.
And Edith says this all the time. And at first I'm so resistant, but so many people say, if it hadn't been for this experience, I never would be connected to my heart. I never would be the person I am today. Right. And there's a story that Edith talks about in the book that's just so powerful. And it's this rabbi who loses his son. His son dies in a really bizarre disease that he had. And the rabbi said that after the death of his beloved son, that he became a much better, more connected, more compassionate, more because of that trauma that he experienced. And at the same time, he said, I would give everything up to have my son back. But
yeah, we don't want to ever be saying that.
Right. Yeah, because the last thing you want to say to anyone who is dying is, oh, well, in this trauma, you'll thank it, much later. No, I'm in this, I'm suffering, and I cannot see the light there is no tunnel, there's light anywhere.
And to those, and Linda, maybe you can relate to this, working with writers, those who think that, artists and writers have a kind of reputation of thinking that they need to suffer to produce good art. So we also don't want to suggest that that's the only way. And of course, learning through people's stories, creative visualization, which was in this course, where we had to imagine ourselves getting diagnosis, getting closer and closer to death, and finally dying. We did, I think, 4 different creative visualizations, maybe 5 over the course. And there was a lot of space between our sessions where we were really integrating journaling, maybe a week off, processing. There are other ways to feel what others have felt and to come alive and have growth and without tragedy.
Exactly, absolutely. And that's why imagination is so fundamental, and creativity is so fundamental to take us further and to take us to those places. And yeah, one of the big questions that I ask every time I come across one of these big, the Dalai Lama and, other Sadhguru and other people, I ask this question, or big rabbis, I say, is it possible to get to a level of consciousness and growth and wisdom to where people get to without going through suffering? Because the example of Buddha and every example that we have so far, right, has been with so much suffering. All the stories in the different cultures and the different religions, who are the people that achieve the highest spiritual awakenings? It's through suffering. So my question always is it possible for us to learn from this and, get to this place and get to this wisdom and growth without having to go through the suffering? So that's a question that I don't have an answer to yet. And that might be my next book. I don't know.
I love to leave that open to what people think. And maybe we can ask people their thoughts on that. I mean, and sitting with the question, what a beautiful thing.
Yes.
Well, yeah, and Buddhism says life is suffering. I mean, just being in the body, and the more that we get stuck in the past, the more that we sort of reach for the future, the more we suffer, right? So I don't know that it's even possible to have this body, to be a spiritual being having a human experience. That's such an interesting question. I love it.
Something maybe for the next podcast we can explore that.
Okay.
from the physical and the spiritual and the psychological perspective. See.
Let's do it. Maybe we'll find some answers there. That's a wonderful question to leave us with. I know I've kept you both for about an hour now. Is there anything major that we missed that we should speak to? And then as a final round, let's let people know what's coming up next for both of you and how they can find you.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I do say, and I think it's important to remember, is that part of what trauma does is that it isolates us and disconnects us. And being aware of doing this work is taking the responsibility as part of a society that we live in, as part of a community and part of being in the human community, to keep the connection going. And if we allow ourselves to go through this process and get to this stage of post-traumatic growth, which I think we all can get to at some point or another, and it's not a linear process. It's up and down and up and goes, and you go around, and you can get to the fifth stage and go to the first stage. But going through it and having a more conscious life really promotes and creates the interconnection that I think it's so fundamental that we all have. It's recognizing it and having it, and that's what can move us forward. So my intention always is create more community and more interconnectedness and more consciousness through this work. So I really, really appreciate having conversations like this, because that's what keeps us going, and it's so enriching, really. I love it.
And I just want to say, one of the things that's the most powerful part of this work that Edith is doing is that these stages, well, two things. These stages are not just, not only because they're also important, but it's not only for the individual, even an individual that then moves into community. It's also to heal communities. It's to heal, right? Cultures, if, it's a long string of work for sure. But also one of our responsibilities, and Edith talks about intergenerational trauma. As we do this work, one of our responsibilities, one way that we can say yes to this work is to know that if we do this work and we move into growth, that we have the power and the wherewithal to stop trauma from moving on to the next generation, because we are no longer in its clutches and our behavior is no longer really supported by our traumas. We can say we can stop the intergenerational trauma. And that is, for me, that is really a beautiful, beautiful aspect of Edith's work. It's that intergenerational. That's our responsibility, right?
Chapter 5.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes.
I remember it now. You said that there's a vicarious, growth, vicarious post-traumatic growth. And I love that. We just had someone come talk about, vicarious trauma. Well, there's vicarious post-traumatic growth. And that leaves us with such a clear and strong mission for all of us. Thank you, Linda, for bringing us, circular to that, have these conversations for purpose. And you really left us with a clear vision of our responsibilities, each of us, to create that world together. And, everyone should get the book and read carefully through the stages. And we all have work to do on ourselves. So whether you identify as, a trauma survivor or not, we've all been through our stuff. We're all carrying stuff, our parents, our grandparents, and we all have our work to do. And what you've laid out there, it can help anyone to grow.
Thank you so much. And there's a link. You can get the book in Amazon. You can get it on Barnes & Noble. You can get it at an independent store. You can go to my website, which is www.dredithshiro.com, and get the book there. Ask Lara where to get it. She knows.
We're going to link everything in the show notes and all over. And we blast this out. We hope many, many people will benefit from this conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lara.
Thank you both.
As we buzz around the busy world, it becomes clear there are billions of paths. As we buzz around the busy world, we will appear in other people's photographs. As we speed through the centuries, we will collide and the light will bend. We will be accidentally immortalized in someone else's land.